And welcome back. As we go ahead and continue looking at classes, let's go ahead and take them in to start looking at some of those methods. We have, of course, seen some of these. We've seen, of course, write output and read input. But now let's go ahead and take a look at those with other things. How can we start looking at the different types of methods that are out there? So starting off with that conversation of the types of methods, as we have mentioned previously, there are two kinds of class methods. We have those that return a value and those that perform an action. So for example, if we do a print line from system.out, this is actually a method that performs an action rather than returning a value. In this case, that action is to write to the screen. If I have something like nextInt from the scanner class though, that's a method that's returning a value that's typed in from the user because they're getting that value. Now recall that methods that contain the keyword void are methods that perform an action rather than returning a value. And that's a good way for us to keep those separated. And there's some differences in how we actually start putting these methods together, how we actually start constructing them. While both methods are going to be very similar, they do bear some slight different constructions. So in a void method, it's going to be public void, whatever the name of our method is, and then any parameters. And then we have an example here. So public void write output. We've seen this. What about a method that returns a value? Public type returned, method name, parameter list. So for example, when we say public string get name, you'll notice that in here we don't have the keyword void anymore. Instead we have the type we want. So it's a string. If we wanted to get a date first try, for example, it would be public date first try get date, for example, if we had a method like that set up. Now later we examined when to replace public with much more strict modifiers, because of course you see everything right now is public, 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 but it is possible to add additional modifiers as well to these. But this is going to be a good start for us now, knowing that we can have the option of having a public void or a public type such as string. Now when we actually look at returning values, if a method can return a value, it must be of the same type as what the method is defined for. So if I say, for example, public double my method, it has to return a double. If I say public string your method, it has to return a string. If it says public void our method, well, that means it's not returning any value. Or, another way to think about this is our void definitions. Now, the keyword void, of course, is used in place of a type and roughly means that we don't have any return type here. Now, invocation is a fancy terminology that gets used a lot, but it's something that we've already been using. An invocation of a method is simply just when a method returns a value that can be used in an expression. Any place that the value of the type return can be used. So if we look at an example here, we say double D equals an object dot my method. And remember, my method returns type double. And I have a string variable equals an object dot your method. If you remember, your method, we have previously said, is going to return a string type. Now a void method doesn't return a value, but it's simply going to perform an action. Therefore, the invocation is merely just going to be a statement. So I can say an object dot our method. Notice there's no variable here that needs to hold that value. That's the biggest difference here. Here we have a double, we have a string, but here there's no value here because again we're not expecting it to return that value. Now let's take a look at those parameter lists. That's kind of like the last chunk we can need to look at when we look at how these methods are constructed. Well, parameter lists are sometimes also referred to, referred to as arguments is another way. Of course, methods in other programming languages are sometimes called functions or procedures. But these are the values that a method needs to complete its operation. Now, we've only presented examples that require empty parameter lists up to this point. So, in other words, there's nothing you have to actually plug in for that method. But it's important to note you have to have those parentheses there, even if you don't have any arguments being passed in for your parameter list. And we're going to discuss parameter lists and how to include values for those methods later on. But for now, we're going to focus on simply just these things that aren't going to require anything because it's going to be easier for us as we start to learn about them. Now let's actually look at the body, so the code that we're putting inside of a void method. Well, the body of a void method definition is simply just a list of declarations and statements enclosed in a pair of curly brackets. We've seen some pretty simple ones up to this point, but here's our method. Let's say we define this as system.out.println hello, system.out.println from our method. Notice it's more than one line of code. Again, just as I mentioned previously, everything is inside of these curly brackets here. Now, when we look at the body of a return method, it's going to be the same as the by of a void method. However, we're going to have a return statement included. So in here, of course, this one is doing a little bit more. We have a scanner in here, we have a print line, we have a string that's storing that, and then you notice it says return result was entered. Now, this could, of course, just say return result. That'd be perfectly valid. We could have it return something else. It just has to be whatever gets returned, it has to be of type string. I can't have it, for example, return a scanner. That's not going to be a valid type for it to return. It has to return whatever type is defined up here. And while a method that returns value can do other things other than returning a value, our styling rules dictate that whatever the method does should be related back to that value that's returned. So for example, if we're looking to find the smallest number in a set of numbers, well, we're going to expect that that should return some type of numeric value. That's typically the kind of expectation. Now, what about using return in a void method? Well, if you want to end a void method before it runs out of statements, in other words, before it reaches the end, you can technically use a return statement without an expression. You can just say return. And you might handle this with, for example, like an if statement having in there. You might say, if such a condition exists, return. It's a good way for it to fall out of that method without breaking code. Now, a void method need not have any return statement to it. But you can place a return statement in a void method if there are situations, as I mentioned, such as using a condition to test for certain things, that require that method end before your entire code is executed. Now, no, this is not something you're likely to encounter, especially in our examples that we're first starting off, but it's presented here more for our knowledge. And for our purposes here, we're going to actually refrain from using return if we're constructing a void method. As you get more advanced on in your programming career, you become more comfortable, there might be times or situations you say, you know what, it'd be really handy for me to exit out of this before, and if this is not going to be the case, I can just continue execution of the code. All right, and so here we are over in Eclipse to go ahead and take a look at our date class again. Now, I went ahead and renamed this to date second try because I went ahead and added a bunch more stuff here that I felt it was needing for us to update the name of it. And so date second try, you can see, has a lot of the same stuff that we are familiar with. We have our 3 instance variables here. We have string month, we have int day, int year. I have my write output method. I have my read input method that I previously had defined, allows me to check for months and stuff like that. And then down here, you can see we have down here, get day, get year, get month. And then, of course, there's also another handling of this fatal error here for the months. Now, what that means is I can probably actually clean my code up a little bit here, because this says, remember, this says if it's not one of these months here, throw an error. Well, down here, I have an error here. So I'm actually going to clean this code up here because I no longer need this if statement here. Boop, and that's going to clean that up. Still going to leave these in here so we can have the day and year be processed. But now it says when we do month.keyboard.next, it's going to, of course, try to get month. And you can see how that is working. Now, the only issue is if I take that out of here, if I am first, of course, trying to get a month that is not a valid month right upon input, it's still going to take that as a valid input. So I'm going to leave this in here, but I'm also going to leave this else statement just in case of something else happens, because it's just a nice, good handling situation here. But let's take a look at these method banners here. So of course we have our public void write output. This is a void method, which means is it returning a type? No, there's no return statement here. I have public void read input. Again, void. We look in here, even though we have all this stuff going on, there's no return statement here. And then now we get to this one. It says public int get day, return day. Well, this is a integer type, so it's going to return a int. And what int is it returning? It's returning the day instance variable. And we'll get in more to why later as to what these methods are actually doing. But just know that if I wanted to know what this variable is, I can call this method and it would allow me to know that the value of that variable is whatever stored in day. Similar with get year, it's going to function the same way. Notice it's a type int and returns the variable year. Now month is a little different here. You notice this is a public int get month. It's not returning a string. And this is why I wanted to leave this here, because this is actually simply just going to return numeric values. If you notice, it's returning 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And of course we have our else in here just to handle some weird cases that might happen. And it's using ignore case to test for January, February, March, etc. However, again, you notice the return value is not a string which means even though the variable is a string, we don't have to have it return a string value. Notice it is a 1 here. Now what happens if I try to make this a string? Well, if I try to make this a string, you'll notice we get a bunch of errors here because, again, what is the type that's being returned? It's returning an integer. So I would, of course, if this was the case, I'd have to return, for example, return January, return February, return March, etc. All right, and I'm just going to go ahead and leave this as in for now because later on we might say, you know what, we want this to print out in a certain form. Maybe we don't want it to say the word January. Maybe we want it to print out in a short date format where it can be like the number 1. All right, so this is, of course, something that we can use in here that might be valuable later on. But if you actually want to see this in use, let's go over to our main here. I went ahead and created one real quick. And of course, I have my read input, and then I have a invocation of get day here, just so we can kind of see what that's doing. And then it's storing it in the date number variable. So I'm just going to go ahead and run this real quick. And let's go ahead and enter in March. How about 14, 1984? All right, hit enter. And we get that is the 14th day of the month because it's going to process each of these. Remember, this is the month, the day, and the year, which means it's going to pull in the number 14. That is what this is doing right here because it's, notice, we never actually have to type in a second thing here to get the day because it's stored as an instance variable of this class here. And because it's now stored in that class, I can then store it in a local variable to this class and then print out that variable here with this command. I could, of course, do the exact same thing here with, let's say, year. But if you notice, I don't have a variable for year. Well, I could just say, you know what, I'm going to do date.get, and then notice I can actually reference it directly. I don't have to necessarily store this in a variable. I can just say that is the, I'm just going to change this to year. Actually, let's move year. I'm going to move that here. Boom. There we go. And so now it's going to say that is the year, and it says date.getYear. If I run it again, let's go ahead and do March. How about 24, 1745? And he says that is the 24th day of the month. That is the year 1745. So I just wanted to show you that because notice here I could store it in a variable. Or if I'm using, for example, a print line statement, I can, of course, reference that directly to have it printed out. Now, if I just put out here, like, for example, date.get, let's say, month, I can put this here, and it will get the month. But because it's not stored anything, once it moves to this next line of code, it's going to be gone. So if we had something like this, I would need to, of course, put this into a variable. Because otherwise, again, it's not going to contain that value from this point forward in the code.